Welcome back to the NCA Fire of Liberty podcast. I am Mr. Garcia, the head of school at Naples Classical Academy. In the last episode, we talked about the birth of traditional education among the Greeks. It was just there's a lot more there than the 20 whatever minutes we broke into. So please feel free to look into it. But today, I want to walk you through the rest of the tradition, where it went after Greece, how it was maintained, all of those things right up into our current and sort of modern situation. At the end of the last episode, I suggested that, and I don't think that this is an exaggeration, that the march of civilization, its success and rise are, or parallel, I would say, the vibrancy, the success, the good of traditional schools like ours. I think you see that in history. And so we're going to kind of walk through that here today. I want to begin just by saying the collapse of education in every civilization is one which I think is a part of a misunderstanding of what true leisure is and what man was made for. It goes sort of back to the very beginning of the last episode. By nature, man is ordered to knowing things, knowing true things, and that should be the pursuit of his life, and that the end of that pursuit is happiness, right? And so when that's true leisure is learning, pursuing the truest things, the superior things. It's where we started last time. So you may hear me say that a lot. The march of civilization, I think, parallels man's desire for that. And when it's at its height, civilization too is at its height. And when it is not, we see the decline and the fall of civilizations. And that is man ordering his life to what I would call true leisure, the pursuit of truth and knowledge for his own sake, the sake of his family, the sake of his country, society. When it doesn't happen, there's an onset, I would suggest, of decadence. What happens when man is successful in pursuing his end? He creates a society where there's prosperity and peace. And then what happens? Oftentimes, he has to work less, or he doesn't work as hard. He finds other things to spend his time doing that are not the primary things to which he is ordered. And then a decadence can set in. And that's a different kind of leisure, right? It's the inversion, right, of those things. It's letting the superior things lapse and letting the inferior things be the things that we place or pursue with all of our heart and soul. And what comes from that very often, and we see this in history, is a sort of decadence. And that tends to be rooted in sloth. Learning is hard. It's not easy. It's called learning because we don't know the thing. If we don't know the thing, it may not just come easily to us. We may have to read a certain passage over and over and over again in order to acquire its meaning, not impose our own meaning on it, to acquire the meaning of the author, right? That's the purpose of learning. The purpose of learning isn't to take my wisdom, impose it on a text because I don't understand it. It's to read the text to understand what the author is trying to say, right? And so there can be, what happens in those times is a sort of laziness of the mind, right? And so we see that in every historical epoch. And as the Greek world is fading, we see the Roman world arising. In the 2nd and the 3rd century BC, you have the Macedonian Wars, in which the Romans conquer the Greeks. That's in about 143 BC. The thing about it was that the Romans loved a lot of things about Greek culture. They loved the architecture and the literature. They loved the education. And so while they conquered them, they also assimilated much of Greek culture into their own culture. And during this time, they encountered the Greeks, what we would call the humanitas, the human, the liberal education, the traditional education that I've been talking about. And they assimilated it for themselves, and they became sort of Greek in their way of pursuing human education. They studied Plato, Homer, Aristotle, and that just became a part of Roman culture, right? And every human being was educated in a similar way to the way, the means and ways in which we discussed in the last episode. A great example of this is Cicero, a spokesman and statesman among the Romans. He says in De Oratore, "What nobler employment or more valuable to the state than the man who instructs the rising generation?" He understood that at the heart of a successful civilization was the instruction of the people, the education, the pursuit of true knowledge. This becomes the sort of way forward for the Romans. There are many other examples we could talk about, but I'm just kind of going to fast forward to the fall of the Roman Empire in about the 5th century AD. At that time, you see this thing that I sort of talked about a little bit at the beginning here, a sort of falling away from those principles of education, which led to some degradation of the family and education and the political system, and all of those things begin to sort of collapse. But even after the fall of the Roman Empire, and we have to think about this because Europe doesn't exist yet, it hasn't sort of, those countries, Italy, England, France, Germany, that we think of aren't in existence yet. So the empire falls, and what you have is this sort of kind of tribalism. There's one united system of government that exists at that point, and it's the Catholic or the Christian Church. And so while the liberal arts, at that point, the traditional education after the fall of the Roman Empire is not sort of everywhere and universally being given to people anymore, it is maintained. And it's maintained throughout the course of Christendom or the Middle Ages by a number of different people. And so we'll just run through a handful of them. The bridge between Greek and Roman and the modern sort of Christendom at this point is Boethius in about 480 AD. Boethius preserves a number of the classical texts by translating them from Greek into Latin, because now Latin has become sort of the language as a result of the Roman Empire. Now you have these two primary languages, Latin and Greek, and Boethius, recognizing that people now largely speak Latin, begins the translation of those texts from Greek to Latin. Aristotle, Plato, Homer, all of these other philosophical works, great works, he's translating into Latin. His translations are going to endure throughout the period. They'll be the primary translations that people use. He wrote a ton of other things, including, and this is a proof of his own liberal education. It wasn't just humanities and philosophy that he wrote. He wrote things on math, preserving the work of Nicomachus, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy. He translated all of those things, and he even wrote a great work called De Musica. So in Boethius, you sort of see the model of the liberal artist. Later on, 490, a guy named Cassiodorus establishes a monastery called the Vivarium. In that monastery are preserved texts from both the Greeks and the Romans, some of which translated by Boethius. He wrote his own works on the liberal arts, music, including the Institutiones. In light of the collapse of the Roman Empire, here are these two men in a society which is basically, the political system now is tribalism. Here are these two men who were striving to preserve this means of education for the good of man. None of them really made any attempts to change that system. So now the system is going to remain, the educational system of the Greeks and the Romans will remain in place moving forward as Christendom begins to grow. And so we see Europe being born after the fall of the Roman Empire as a result of these different countries rising up with their different sort of kings and those sorts of things. One of the primary people who helped maintain the liberal arts education, the traditional education, is King Charlemagne, who was the Holy Roman Emperor in the late 9th century. A man not well educated himself as a child, received this education from a man that he brought into closely into his advice, named Alcuin. Charlemagne recognized the beauty and the importance of the liberal arts, the traditional education. He began bringing all of these brilliant men into his court and around him, and one of those people was Alcuin. Alcuin was a teacher of grammar and dialectic and rhetoric. Dialectic is just another word really for logic. And so he develops texts on handwriting and mathematics, and he's at Charlemagne's side teaching him all of these things. And they began the process of bringing this education to all of Europe. They carried it to Christian culture. It's part of the reason why Charlemagne is often known not only as the Holy Roman Emperor, but the father of Europe. It was through the process of Charlemagne and Alcuin bringing back to all of Europe the traditional education that Europe began to grow and was sort of restored and became what it is today. Okay, that's going to go on and continue into the scholastic period. The education is going to continue to flourish and grow. And in about the 13th century, 1224 AD, we find a person, Thomas Aquinas, who's a preacher, a teacher, and an author. He says of the liberal arts, quote, "They are called liberal arts in order to distinguish them from those arts which are ordained to works done by the body, which arts are in a fashion servile, inasmuch as the body is in servile subjection to the soul, and man, as regards his soul, is free." This goes back to what I said in the first episode, and a thing that I will say over and over again. It's so important in education to recognize and to remember that the history of the liberal arts is rooted in an understanding that education, true education, is the forming, the sculpting of man, right? And it begins with the superior things, right? The knowing all of the true things, justice, friendship, charity, studying those things, understanding those things to sculpt man's soul so that he can do vocational work. Okay, so 1,500 years prior to this, you see the same idea in the Greeks. So there's no deviation in the idea of what education is meant to be. You see it in the Romans, you see it in the Greeks, and now you see it in medieval Christendom. The power of man resides in his willingness to pursue moral excellence, to pursue virtue. And the good that is produced by the liberal arts is the knowledge of those things. That's the good. And Aquinas may, at least in my humble opinion, have been one of the most brilliant of the liberal artists. He wrote entire summaries of theology, beginning from the examination of the material world, the universe. Very much like Aristotle, he was a humanist and a lover of truth. He saw the good and the order in the universe, and he saw how man fit into that and recognized that there were things that man needed to know for his own good that were true and that he should pursue, and that this whole pursuit was a lifetime journey. He taught extensively at the University of Paris. He received a liberal education himself. And by the time, so now here's the thing. At this point in history, now we're beginning to see the first liberal universities. The University of Bologna in around 1088, which is a liberal arts university, and the University of Paris, which was established around 1150. Both of these universities began by being what were called cathedral schools. They were attached to these cathedrals, churches, and they blossomed into these great centers for liberal learning and the sculpting of man in the traditional education. Okay, so during this period, what happens is the medieval trivium inherited and modified the Romans' version of the trivium, which is very similar to the Greeks, almost exactly the same. In this case, which with the medievals, what you'll see is the addition of two, what they would have called sciences, science, scientia, which means knowledge, right? A true knowledge. So what you'll see is the addition of, it's the two highest sciences, philosophy and theology. So those are what they would call the two highest sciences, the study of God and then the study of the nature of things, which at that point was believed to mean the universe led to the existence of God. And so you see the addition of those two things during the medieval universities. Much of the modern structure of traditional liberal arts education maintains and attempts to recover a lot of their structure and inspiration from the medieval trivium. What you'll see from that time on, the scholastic period, is the continued growth, and I would even argue perfection, of traditional education on into the Renaissance and even into the Reformation and thereafter. Martin Luther, for example, started traditional educational schools. Now, he doubted what he would call, quote, pagan works, like Aristotle in the Ethics. So there's a point of contention with Martin Luther and I. But he encouraged everybody to read the Poetics and to study rhetoric and to become great rhetoricians. Luther assumed that Latin, Greek, and Hebrew would be studied, that those were the foundational, fundamental languages that everyone should study. Why? Because all of the texts of the educational tradition were written in those languages. And we've all heard the phrase, I think something was lost in translation. What greater good could there be than to have a firm understanding of those languages? If you want to understand Western tradition, you can read those texts in the original language, in the original words that those authors read them. This is one of the primary reasons why we study those foreign languages. Okay, I'm going to fast forward now, and I want to move into the early 20th century. I'm going to talk about a guy named John Dewey. I could say a number of things, I could quote a number of things from Dewey, but I think this one particular quote will be all we need. He proposes an education that's aimed at, and I'm going to quote him, an occupation is a continuous activity having a purpose. Education through occupation consequently combines within itself more of the factors conducive to learning than any other method. Let's say it again because it's important. An occupation is a continuous activity having a purpose. Education through occupation consequently combines within itself more of the factors conducive to learning than any other method. I'm not going to impose some ill will on Dewey here. He may not have intended for what would follow to have happened. But an occupation is a continuous activity having a purpose. Okay, well, in education, in the superior things, is a continuous activity having a purpose. And the purpose of that education is the sculpting of man, his mind and his will in the truest knowledge. We call it wisdom, right? That's the purpose for his happy end, his happiness, right? What has Dewey done here, intentionally or unintentionally, is beyond my ability to know. He's inverted the inferior things in the superior things. He's elevated the inferior things above the superior. He said, we could just do, maybe, and not necessarily have to know, and by doing, maybe we'll somehow come to know the things that we ought to know for our human happiness. And that is where we, I think, have moved to today. He elevated vocational training, learning the practical things, above the training of the human soul for truth and goodness. Now we have to go do the stuff in order to figure out those things, rather than knowing what is true and good, and then with an informed mind choosing to do it. In other words, doing was elevated above knowing. And the constant refrain throughout the course of Western tradition has been really that you can't love what you don't know. And if we took 1 second even to think about that proposition, we would all recognize that that is absolutely true. And I'll give the example that I always give. Many of us are married, and so we didn't fall in love with our wives or our husbands before we met them. The first thing that had to happen was we had to know that they existed. That's the first operation. I have to know that this person exists before I can decide whether or not I'm going to love them, right? We can't love what we don't know. It's the same thing with children. You're married and you have children. You don't have a love for a child that doesn't exist yet. You may love the idea of having children, but until that child comes into the world, you can't give them your love. And when they do, similarly to your wife, there are few things that are more amazing than that relationship and the love that exists between them. But it doesn't occur before the first operation, which is knowing their existence and then coming to know who they are and deciding, do I love all of these things about this person? Am I willing to give myself to this person based on everything that I know about them, right? You can't love what you don't know. And that's an axiom that we have to recover and then begin to live by again. What Dewey did, I think, is that he sort of elevated the loving above the knowing. Well, you can go do this thing, and maybe you'll grow to love it, and then, you'll know more about it, and maybe you'll figure out the way the world works and all of those things. In order to humanize our occupations, our vocational work, what has to happen first is that man has to have a strong mind that has to be rooted very deeply in an understanding and a loving of the superior things. That is the model of Western tradition all the way up to the founders, who I said in the first podcast were liberally educated as well. And you see that in their writings. You hear it, right? In the words of George Washington, as I quoted in the first podcast, when he says, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly, we must know what justice is, considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. If I don't have a deep understanding of the word liberty, and I don't have a deep understanding of the word justice, I am not going to be able to make much of a comment like that, right? But he knew, and that's why he used them, and that's why we must recover it. It's important, I think, to think about this, because what has happened to us, I think now, is that education, in many ways, has not become about cultivating the mind, teaching the mind the truths, how to work and to read and to understand and to think logically and to craft thoughtful, articulate responses, both orally and in writing. When the worker has cultivated the mind first, what will happen is he can then make his work an art, whatever that work might be. Because what happens then is he can see the goodness in what he's doing. He understands the end of the thing. The work constitutes some goodness. That's the hope. All work should. It's ordered to some good as an end. If man has a mind that has been cultivated in the truth and the goodness, then his production will be ordered to that end. And if it's not, he will recognize that and cease to do it, right? He'll understand the bearing that his work has on himself, on his family, on his country, not just in some superficial way, but morally, politically, not just for his own life, but for that of his family, the nation, and the world. In order for this to happen, the superior things have to be put back in the right order, right? The pursuit of intellectual and moral virtue must be the first pursuits of education. So, how do we combat this today? Well, I would say to you, submit, that is the point of the education that is provided from Hillsdale College, whom we work with, who trains us, who gives us our curriculum, and it is the work of Hillsdale Schools, of which we are one. Naples Classical Academy, I would say, is not ordered to the work of making children factory workers. It's not. It is ordered to the profound work of cultivating the mind in truth and goodness. That's the primary work that we do. In the modern world, that can be very difficult because learning is hard. It requires a lot of work. The cultivation of the human soul, its mind, and its will is arduous. And it requires work on the part of the student, not just the teacher and the administration. The student has to wonder and to want and to work, right? The educational system, I think, should seek to establish the rational foundation for good physical, moral, and social behavior. Certainly. All those things are important. Physical, moral, and social behavior. But the foundation of those things is reason. Knowing the truth and what a good thing is so that I can, with my liberty, my freedom, prefer it for my own good, the good of my family, and the good of my country. So, I would submit that we probably find ourselves today, as the historian Toynbee said, I believe, we're never more than a generation away from barbarism. As we've moved through the history of the liberal arts, I have submitted to you that I believe that the success of every civilization is tied to the success of the traditional education. That's a bold statement, but I'm not going to back away from it because I believe it's true. I believe we've seen it in almost every era in history. I believe we find ourselves again today in a sort of very similar situation to that of Rome after its collapse. Not suggesting that we've collapsed, not saying that. Just saying we find ourselves in that situation where education is sort of all over the place, and that inferior things in many ways have been elevated above the superior. And that we have to ask ourselves a question. If we want great-souled men and women, if we want to see statesmen running this country again and building great societies for families and individual people, then how are we going to educate them? And I would just suggest that this is what we try to do here at NCA. What gets us out of bed every day at Naples Classical Academy is this idea that we are here primarily for the recovery of true education, not just because it's my own idea, but because it's rooted in 2,500 years of brilliance. And the idea that it begins with the sculpting of the great man, arete, the man of virtue, who pursues excellence in all things, not just in academia, but in everyday life, his moral and practical work, right? Over the next couple of episodes, I'll discuss the philosophy and the pedagogy of the traditional education and how NCA hopes to play a part in its revival. I'm grateful if you hung on and you stuck around. Hopefully you'll come back and we'll talk more about the philosophy and the pedagogy, but until then, sapientia operibus vindicata.